The airport buzzed with life, a hive of travelers dragging suitcases, flipping through boarding passes, and racing against time. Among them was an unassuming man dressed casually in a plain hoodie, sneakers, and loose jeans. His demeanor was relaxed, even as chaos unfolded around him. He sipped a coffee from a paper cup, his sharp eyes observing the bustling terminal. That man was none other than Michael, known to the world as Big Shaq, a name synonymous with fame, wealth, and success. Yet, today, there wasn't a single flashy sign of his high-profile life. Michael had always preferred to keep things low-key, avoiding the attention that came with his status whenever possible. It was one of those rare days he could enjoy the anonymity of being just another passenger. Today, however, he wasn't merely flying. This trip carried a purpose, a test of both his character and the people around him. As the time ticked closer to boarding, passengers began lining up at gate 42. Standing near the counter was Grace, a flight attendant with a sharp tongue and a no-nonsense attitude. She was meticulous about her job, almost to a fault, but behind her polished uniform and confident posture lay a personality that didn't take kindly to anyone she deemed less than important. Grace believed respect had to be earned, and she wasn't shy about letting her judgmental streak show. Michael approached the gate, his calm expression unchanging as he presented his boarding pass. Grace barely glanced at him, her brow furrowing disdain at his casual attire. To her, he was just another budget traveler, likely someone flying economy with little regard for proper decorum. Without even making eye contact, she motioned him forward with an exaggerated sigh, muttering something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like, "Hurry up." Michael gave her a polite smile, unfazed by the attitude. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him, and it wouldn't be the last. Still, there was something about Grace's dismissiveness that stuck with him. As he walked down the jet bridge, a sarcastic tone echoed in his mind. But he chose to let it go. He wasn't here to make a scene. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin gleamed with luxurious seats and private pods, each designed for ultimate comfort. Michael settled into his assigned seat, tucking his small bag into the overhead compartment. Moments later, Grace entered the cabin, her eyes scanning the area. When she spotted Michael in first class, her perfectly arched brows shot up in surprise. "You must be lost," she said flatly, her voice loud enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers. Michael raised his head, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Excuse me," he replied, his tone polite but firm. "This is first class," Grace continued, her words laced with condescension. "Economy's back that way." A small chuckle rippled through the cabin as a few passengers exchanged amused glances. Michael, however, didn't budge. Instead, he reached into his pocket and retrieved his boarding pass, handing it to Grace without a word. She glanced at it, a frown deepening as she confirmed that he did indeed belong there. "Well then," she said, her tone now stiff with irritation, "enjoy your flight." She handed back the pass and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Michael leaned back in his seat, hiding a small smirk. He'd dealt with people like Grace before, but this encounter felt different. Little did she know, this plane wasn't just carrying him to his destination, it was his. Michael had recently invested in a private aviation company, and this flight was a surprise inspection of their operations. Every inch of the plane, every crew member, and every service interaction fell under his scrutiny. And Grace had just made herself the center of his attention. As the flight prepared for takeoff, Grace continued her rounds, her curt demeanor earning mixed reactions from passengers. Some admired her efficiency. Others quietly rolled their eyes at her thinly veiled disdain. Michael observed her closely, noting every detail of her behavior. The engines roared to life, and the plane ascended into the sky, leaving behind the sprawling city below. Grace returned to the first-class cabin with a tray of refreshments, her expression cool and professional. When she reached Michael's seat, she paused, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Would you like anything to drink?" she asked, the question barely masking her reluctance. Michael looked up, his gaze steady. "Just water, please." She placed the glass in front of him without another word, her movements brisk. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Thank you, Grace." Her name on his lips caught her off guard. She glanced at him, a professional mask faltering for a moment. "You're welcome," she replied stiffly, before walking away. Michael sipped his water, his mind already formulating how this interaction would play into the broader review of his airline. Grace had no idea who he was or the power he wielded, but soon enough the tables would turn. For now, he would play along, allowing the story to unfold. As the flight continued, Grace's sharp remarks and dismissive attitude grew harder to ignore. Passengers murmured amongst themselves, some sharing their own run-ins with her. Michael listened, his calm exterior betraying none of the thoughts swirling in his mind. One thing was clear: this flight would be a wake-up call for Grace. She was about to learn a lesson that would change her perspective forever. But how and when he revealed his true identity remained to be decided. For now, Michael leaned back in his seat, watching the clouds roll by, the anticipation building with each passing moment. The gentle hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin as the flight settled into its cruising altitude. Passengers shifted in their seats, some engrossed in books, others tapping away on laptops, while a few were already dozing off beneath soft blankets. Michael, however, remained alert, his sharp eyes subtly following Grace's movements as she continued her rounds. There was something fascinating about her, an intensity in her demeanor, a certain unyielding pride that seemed to shield her from any vulnerability. For Michael, it wasn't just about the way she had treated him. He had seen plenty of people with biases and sharp tongues, especially in his line of work. What intrigued him was the question of why. Why did Grace carry herself with such guarded hostility? What had shaped her into the person who judged others so quickly, so harshly? A faint memory surfaced. Years ago, before the fame, before the money. Michael had worked odd jobs to make ends meet. He remembered being looked down upon by people who assumed he was destined to stay at the bottom. Back then, he had promised himself two things. He would rise above their expectations, and he would never forget what it felt like to be underestimated. Grace passed by again, this time assisting an elderly woman who struggled to reach for her overhead luggage. Her tone, though polite, was clipped, as if she were suppressing her irritation. "Here, let me help," Grace said, hoisting the bag with practiced ease and setting it down beside the woman. She didn't wait for a thank you before turning away, her expression unchanging. Michael watched the interaction with a slight frown. There was no denying Grace's competence. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. But there was a coldness to her actions, a lack of warmth that made the cabin feel just a little less inviting. Meanwhile, in the economy section, a family of 4 juggled snacks and restless toddlers, their laughter carrying faintly through the cabin doors. A man in business attire worked furiously on his laptop, barely glancing up as the drink cart rattled past. Each passenger had their own story, their own reason for being on this flight. And Grace, for all her sharp edges, was a part of every one of those stories in some small way. As the hours ticked by, Michael's curiosity about her grew. He wasn't the type to pry into people's personal lives, but there was something about Grace that made him want to understand her better. Was she always this way, or was today an exception? Did she even realize how her attitude affected those around her? A faint announcement crackled over the intercom, pulling Michael from his thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts." Grace, now in the aisle near Michael's seat, stepped into action, ensuring passengers complied with the instructions. Her voice was firm but calm, a tone that carried authority without inviting argument. Even in the face of potential disruption, she exuded control, her movements precise and deliberate. As the plane hit its first jolt, Michael felt a slight shift in the atmosphere. The easy chatter of passengers quieted, replaced by a tense silence. Grace continued moving through the cabin, her steps steady even as the turbulence worsened. Michael couldn't help but admire her composure. Despite her earlier behavior, it was clear she took her job seriously and knew how to handle pressure. The turbulence lasted only a few minutes, but it was enough to leave a lingering unease among the passengers. Grace returned to the front of the cabin, where she exchanged a few words with another flight attendant. From his seat, Michael couldn't hear what they were saying, but he noticed Grace's expression soften for the briefest moment. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her usual stoic mask. As the plane leveled out and calm returned, Michael found himself lost in thought. He knew this flight wasn't just about observing operations or evaluating the service. It was a chance to connect with people, to understand their experiences and challenges. And Grace, despite her thorny exterior, was no exception. The flight attendants began serving meals, weaving through the aisles with practiced efficiency. When Grace reached Michael's seat, she placed his tray in front of him without a word. He decided to break the silence. "Thanks," he said, his tone friendly. She glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. "You're welcome," she replied curtly before moving on. Michael sighed, realizing it would take more than a polite exchange to crack the surface. He wasn't one to push, but he wasn't one to give up easily either. As the meal service wrapped up, Michael noticed a small group of passengers near the front of the cabin chatting animatedly. One of them, a young man with a camera slung around his neck, was gesturing toward Grace as she worked nearby. Michael's interest peaked as he caught snippets of their conversation. "Do you think she knows who he is?" one of them whispered, glancing in Michael's direction. "Doubt it," another replied, smirking. "She's treating him like he's some nobody." Michael's lips twitched into a small smile. It seemed not everyone on board was oblivious to his identity. But he wasn't here for recognition or special treatment. He was here to see the truth, unfiltered and unpolished. As the hours stretched on, Michael found himself reflecting on his journey. He thought about the people who had doubted him, the challenges he had faced, and the lessons he had learned. Each obstacle had shaped him, just as Grace's experiences had undoubtedly shaped her. But while he had chosen to rise above the negativity, Grace seemed trapped by it, her bitterness coloring every interaction. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight entered its final stretch. Outside, the sky was a canvas of stars, the vast expanse of night stretching endlessly in all directions. Michael leaned back in his seat, his thoughts drifting. He knew that the real test of character wasn't how one treated those they admired, but how they treated those they overlooked. Grace made one last round through the cabin, her expression as guarded as ever. When she passed Michael's seat, he caught her eye and offered a small nod. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding back, a flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps, crossing her face. The plane began its descent, and the captain's voice filled the cabin once more, instructing passengers to prepare for landing. Grace moved with renewed purpose, ensuring everyone was seated and secured. Michael watched her closely, wondering if she had any idea of the surprise that awaited her. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, the cabin filled with the usual shuffle of passengers gathering their belongings. Grace stood at the front, her posture immaculate, ready to bid farewell to the travelers she had served. But before she could say a word, Michael rose from his seat and made his way toward her. "Thank you for your service today," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Just doing my job," she replied, her tone as neutral as ever. Michael smiled faintly. "I appreciate it. I'll be sure to mention you in my feedback." Grace blinked, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Feedback." He nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes. After all, it's not every day the owner of the plane gets to fly with his crew." Her jaw dropped slightly, but before she could respond, Michael turned and stepped off the plane, leaving her standing there, stunned. Grace stood frozen at the front of the plane, her mind racing as Michael's words echoed in her head. Asterisk the owner of the plane. Asterisk for a moment, the bustling sounds of disembarking passengers faded into the background. She glanced toward the jet bridge, where Michael had disappeared, her professional composure struggling to mask the rising wave of disbelief. Her thoughts spiraled as she replayed every interaction she had with him during the flight. The casual way he had presented his boarding pass, the quiet confidence he carried, and most of all the way he had looked at her, not with disdain or frustration, but with something deeper. She couldn't help but feel the weight of her own actions pressing down on her. If what he said was true, then everything she had assumed about him was wrong. As the last of the passengers exited the plane, Grace finally snapped back to reality. She quickly busied herself with post-flight duties, but her usual efficiency was tinged with an unusual distraction. Her colleagues noticed the shift, exchanging puzzled glances but saying nothing. Grace wasn't the type to share personal feelings, and they knew better than to press her. In the terminal, Michael walked with his usual calm demeanor, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Though his face betrayed none of his thoughts, his mind was alive with contemplation. He hadn't revealed his identity to humiliate Grace or assert power over her. He wanted to plant a seed, a moment of reflection that might lead her to reconsider how she treated people. But he also knew change wasn't guaranteed. Grace's reaction would determine the next steps, and for now, he had to wait. Meanwhile, Grace finished her duties and retreated to the flight attendant's lounge. The room was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos she had dealt with earlier. She sank into a chair, her hands still gripping the passenger manifest. Her eyes scanned the list, stopping at Michael's name. It didn't stand out, just another name among many, but now it carried a significance she couldn't ignore. She pulled out her phone and searched his name out of curiosity. Within moments, the screen filled with articles, photos, and videos detailing his journey from humble beginnings to becoming a globally recognized figure. He wasn't just a wealthy man. He was a philanthropist, an advocate for equality, and someone who valued respect and kindness. The more she read, the more the knot in her stomach tightened. She had judged him without knowing a thing about him, and now she was left grappling with the consequences of her actions. Back in the airport, Michael met with a representative from his aviation company, a middle-aged man named Paul who oversaw the airline's operations. Paul greeted him warmly, his smile genuine but tinged with the nervous energy of someone eager to please. "How was the flight, Mr. Shaq?" Paul asked, walking alongside him toward the private office. Michael glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "It was enlightening," he replied, his tone giving nothing away. Paul hesitated, sensing there was more to the answer, but he didn't push. Instead, he followed Michael into the office, where they discussed the flight's performance. Michael shared his observations, both the positives and the areas needing improvement. When it came to the crew, he spoke carefully, knowing his words would carry weight. "There's one flight attendant I want to highlight," Michael said, leaning back in his chair. "Grace." Paul's brow furrowed. "Grace. Is there an issue?" Michael considered his response. "She's good at her job. Efficient, professional, and capable. But there's something missing, something that can't be taught in training." Paul nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken implication. "I see. You want me to address it with her directly?" Michael shook his head. "Not yet. Let's give her some time to reflect. People grow when they're given the chance." Paul agreed, though he couldn't help but wonder what exactly had transpired on that flight. Michael wasn't the type to single someone out without a reason, and his measured words hinted at a deeper story. For Grace, the rest of her shift felt unusually long. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake, one that might follow her. She thought about Michael's calm demeanor and the way he had carried himself despite her behavior. He could have confronted her during the flight, could have embarrassed her in front of passengers and crew, but he hadn't. Instead, he had left her to sit with her own actions, a silence that spoke louder than any rebuke. Later that evening, Grace returned to her small apartment, her mind still buzzing. She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her uniform crisp and neat, but her eyes betraying her exhaustion. She had always prided herself on being strong, independent, and unshakable. But tonight, she felt cracks forming in the armor she had so carefully constructed. She thought about why she had become a flight attendant in the first place. It wasn't just for the travel or the steady paycheck. It was about escape. Escaping a past filled with struggles and a childhood where respect was hard-earned but rarely given. She had built walls to protect herself. But somewhere along the way, Those walls had turned into barriers between her and the world. The next day, Grace arrived at work with a heavy heart. She went through her routine with the same precision as always, but her colleagues noticed the slight change in her demeanor. There was a softness to her tone, a hesitation in her movements, as if she were carrying an invisible weight. Meanwhile, Michael had decided to keep tabs on the crew's progress through Paul. Though he had no immediate plans to confront Grace again, he couldn't deny his curiosity about how she would respond to their encounter. He believed in second chances, but he also knew not everyone was willing to take them. Grace's shift ended without incident, but she couldn't shake the lingering unease. As she sat in the staff lounge, a phone buzzed with a message from a fellow crew member who had noticed her distraction. "Everything okay?" the message read. "You've seemed different lately." Grace hesitated before typing a reply. "Just a lot on my mind. Thanks for asking." She didn't elaborate, but the brief exchange left her feeling slightly lighter. It was a reminder that she wasn't as alone as she often felt. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to start letting those walls down. Michael, on the other hand, returned to his daily life, attending meetings, planning future ventures, and focusing on his philanthropic projects. Yet, Grace's image lingered in his mind. He didn't know if their paths would cross again, but he couldn't help but hope she would find her way, just as he had once found his. For now, the story was far from over, and the threads of their unexpected connection continued to weave together, waiting for the moment they would intersect once more. Days passed, but Grace couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was standing at the edge of something significant, something she couldn't yet define. Every night, she replayed the flight in her mind, Michael's calm demeanor, his parting words, and the quiet authority he carried. The more she thought about him, the more unsettled she became, not because of what he had said, but because of what it forced her to confront within herself. At work, she kept her head down, immersing herself in her duties with an almost mechanical precision. She avoided long conversations with her colleagues, worried that they might see through her carefully maintained facade. But there was an energy in the air, a sense that something was about to change, and Grace couldn't ignore it. Michael, too, felt the pull of unfinished business. Though his schedule was packed with meetings and projects, Grace lingered in his thoughts. He had learned long ago that people rarely changed without the right kind of push, and he wondered if he had done enough to spark that shift in her. Still, he decided to give her space, trusting that the seeds of self-reflection he had planted would grow in time. One afternoon, while Michael was reviewing proposals in his office, Paul entered with a folder in hand. "There's something you should see," Paul said, placing the folder on Michael's desk. Michael raised an eyebrow, but opened the folder without hesitation. Inside were reports from the airline's crew evaluations, including feedback from passengers and colleagues. Grace's name appeared multiple times, her performance rated highly for professionalism and efficiency. But there was also a recurring note: asterisk lacks warmth in interactions. Could benefit from building stronger connections with passengers asterisk. Michael leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. The reports confirmed what he had observed on the flight, but they also gave him hope. Grace was clearly capable and respected for her skills. She just needed to find the balance between professionalism and empathy. "Do you think she's aware of this feedback?" Michael asked, tapping the folder lightly. Paul nodded. "She's been made aware, but she's resistant to change. She sees it as a distraction from doing her job." Michael's gaze sharpened. "Maybe it's time to show her that it's not just about the job, it's about the people." Paul hesitated. "What do you have in mind?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, his fingers steepled as a plan began to take shape in his mind. Meanwhile, Grace was assigned to a high-profile flight, a corporate trip for executives from a prominent company. The atmosphere was different from her usual routes, the passengers more demanding, and the expectations higher. Grace was determined to prove herself, pouring all her energy into ensuring everything ran smoothly. But beneath her composed exterior, she felt the pressure mounting. As the flight progressed, Grace noticed a familiar figure among the passengers, Michael. He was seated in the same quiet, unassuming manner as before, but this time there was a subtle difference in his demeanor. He seemed more watchful, as if he were waiting for something. Grace's heart sank. She hadn't expected to see him again, especially not under these circumstances. Her first instinct was to avoid him, but she knew that wasn't an option. Whatever this was, she would have to face it head-on. Michael, for his part, was careful not to draw attention to himself. He observed Grace from a distance, noting the small changes in her behavior. She was still efficient and composed, but there was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a hint that the walls she had built were starting to crack. The flight continued without incident until it was time for meal service. Grace approached Michael's seat, her hands steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. She placed the tray in front of him, her voice calm, but softer than before. "Your meal, sir." Michael looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Grace." The sound of her name coming from him startled her, but she managed a small nod before moving on. The exchange was brief, but it left her rattled. For the rest of the flight, she couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was testing her somehow, though she didn't know why. As the plane neared its destination, an unexpected announcement came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to acknowledge a special guest on today's flight. Please join us in thanking Mr. Michael Shaq for his continued support and contributions to our airline." The cabin erupted in applause, passengers turning to look at Michael with newfound curiosity and admiration. Grace felt her stomach drop. She had known he was important, but she hadn't realized just how significant he was to the airline itself. Michael stood briefly, acknowledging the applause with a modest smile before sitting back down. His eyes briefly met Grace's, and she felt an overwhelming urge to disappear. The weight of her earlier treatment of him crashed over her like a wave, and for the first time in years, she felt truly vulnerable. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, Grace braced herself for what might come next. She had no idea if Michael would confront her again, or if he would simply walk away as he had before. The uncertainty gnawed at her, building tension with every passing second. When the last passenger exited, Grace busied herself with her duties, hoping to avoid any further interaction. But as she turned to leave the cabin, she found Michael standing near the exit, waiting. He looked at her with a calm intensity that made her heart race. "We need to talk," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Grace nodded, her throat dry. She followed him into the empty terminal, her mind racing with questions. What did he want to say? And more importantly, what could she possibly say in return? The silence between them stretched as they walked, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. Grace knew this moment would define everything. Her career, her self-perception, and perhaps even her future. She just didn't know how it would end. Grace followed Michael down the quiet terminal, her heart pounding as the weight of his words settled over her. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the vast empty space, and she couldn't decide if the silence between them was a comfort or a punishment. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew this moment would be a turning point. Michael stopped abruptly near a set of large windows overlooking the runway. Planes taxied in the distance, their engines humming softly in the background. He turned to face her, his expression calm but unreadable. Grace braced herself, her pulse quickening, as she searched his face for any hint of what was to come. "I've been thinking about you," Michael began, his voice steady. "About what happened on that flight, and about why it happened." Grace swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. She felt exposed, like he could see right through her polished exterior to the insecurities she tried so desperately to hide. Michael continued, his tone softening slightly. "You're good at your job, Grace. That much is clear. But there's something missing, something that can't be taught in a training manual." Grace felt her cheeks flush with a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness. "I don't understand," she said quietly, though deep down she knew exactly what he meant. Michael's gaze didn't waver. Respect. Empathy. Treating people like they matter, no matter who they are, or what they look like. Grace felt a lump form in her throat, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "I wasn't trying to be disrespectful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was just doing my job." Michael studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Maybe you were. But sometimes doing the bare minimum isn't enough. People remember how you make them feel, Grace. That's what matters." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She wanted to argue, to explain herself, but she knew he was right. She had spent so much time building walls to protect herself that she had forgotten how to connect with others. And now she was paying the price. Before she could respond, Michael took a step closer, his expression softening. "I'm not here to tear you down," he said. "I see potential in you, Grace. I wouldn't be having this conversation if I didn't think you could do better." Grace blinked, surprised by the unexpected kindness in his words. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, like maybe she wasn't beyond redemption after all. But just as she was beginning to process his words, a voice interrupted them. "Excuse me, Mr. Shaq." They both turned to see a man in a sharp suit approaching them, his expression serious. He carried a briefcase and an air of urgency that immediately set Grace on edge. Michael frowned slightly. "What is it, James?" The man hesitated, glancing briefly at Grace before addressing Michael. "There's been a situation. It's about the flight. There's something you need to see." Michael's jaw tightened, and Grace felt a cold knot of dread form in her stomach. She had no idea what James was referring to, but the tension in his voice made it clear that whatever it wasn't good. Michael nodded, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Lead the way." James turned and began walking briskly down the terminal, with Michael and Grace following close behind. Grace's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Had she done something wrong? Was this about her? They arrived at a small conference room, where a large screen displayed security footage from the flight. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she saw herself on the screen, interacting with passengers during the meal service. At first, it seemed ordinary enough, until the camera zoomed in on a particular passenger seated near Michael. The man was disheveled, his movements jittery, and his eyes darting nervously around the cabin. Grace's heart sank as she recognized him. He had been one of the passengers she had barely acknowledged, dismissing his erratic behavior as mere impatience. "What's going on?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. James glanced at her, his expression grim. That man was carrying something he shouldn't have been. Something dangerous. Grace's blood ran cold as the implications of his words sank in. "Dangerous? What do you mean?" Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his calm presence grounding her. "Let him finish," he said quietly. James gestured to the screen, where the footage continued to play. The man was carrying a device, a piece of technology he shouldn't have had access to. "We believe he was trying to test security protocols. If he had succeeded, the consequences could have been catastrophic." Grace felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. She had spent the entire flight focusing on maintaining control, on proving herself capable, and yet she had completely missed something so critical. Her hands trembled as she watched the screen, replaying the moments where she had passed by the man without a second thought. Michael's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "This isn't just on you, Grace. Security should have caught this before he even boarded. But it does highlight why it's so important to stay present, to pay attention to the people around you." Grace nodded numbly, her mind reeling. She wanted to disappear, to escape the crushing weight of her failure, but she knew she couldn't. This was her moment of reckoning, and there was no turning back now. Michael turned to James. "What's being done about this?" James straightened, his tone professional. "The authorities have been notified, and we're conducting a full investigation. The man has already been detained, and we're working to determine the extent of his intentions." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Grace, his eyes filled with a mix of understanding and resolve. "This is your wake-up call, Grace. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Grace opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Whatever came next, she knew it would change everything. Grace stood frozen, the weight of Michael's words pressing down on her like a storm cloud. She wanted to explain, to defend herself, but there was nothing she could say to undo the truth playing out on the screen. Her failure to notice the jittery man was undeniable, and it had nearly allowed a disaster to unfold. Michael broke the tense silence, his tone even but firm. "Grace, I brought you here because I believe in second chances. But second chances mean nothing if you don't use them to grow. This situation isn't just about security protocols or procedures. It's about awareness, empathy, and understanding the bigger picture. Do you see that now?" Grace nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I see it." Her mind raced through every interaction on that flight, every missed opportunity to connect with the passengers, every moment she had let her assumptions guide her. She felt exposed, her carefully crafted professionalism now a hollow shell of what she thought it had been. Before she could dwell further, James's phone buzzed. He answered it quickly, his face tightening as he listened. When he hung up, his expression was grave. "We've just learned something new," he said, addressing Michael but glancing at Grace. The man wasn't acting alone. Grace felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" James hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. He was part of a group testing vulnerabilities, not just in the airline, but across several sectors. "We intercepted communications that suggest someone else was planted on the flight, possibly as a backup." The room went silent as the gravity of his statements sank in. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. She replayed the flight in her mind, searching for any other signs she might have missed. The passengers, the crew, had there been someone else? Someone who had gone unnoticed, just like the jittery man. Michael's jaw tightened. "Do we have any leads?" James shook his head. "Not yet, but whoever it is, they're well trained. They blended in perfectly." The words hung in the air like a warning bell. Grace's mind raced, her memories of the flight a blur of faces and voices. Then, like a flash of lightning, it hit her. There had been one passenger who had stood out, but not in an obvious way. A man seated in first class, impeccably dressed and polite to a fault. He had kept to himself for most of the flight, but there had been something about him that felt calculated. "I think I know who it is," Grace said suddenly, her voice trembling but resolute. Michael and James turned to her, their expressions sharp with attention. "Who?" Michael asked. Grace hesitated, feeling the weight of their scrutiny. "A man in first class. He was quiet, too quiet. He didn't interact with anyone except to give short, polite answers. I thought he was just reserved, but now I'm not so sure." James immediately pulled up the passenger manifest on his tablet, scrolling through the names. "Can you describe him?" Grace nodded, her mind focusing on the details she had noticed. Mid-40s, dark hair, clean-shaven. He was wearing a navy suit and had a leather briefcase. He ordered a drink but didn't touch it. And his eyes, they felt like they were always watching. James found the name and handed the tablet to Michael. "Peter Graves," Michael read aloud. "Listed as a financial consultant. No red flags on his background, but that doesn't mean much." Michael handed the tablet back to James. "Run a deeper check on him. Find out everything you can." James nodded and left the room, leaving Grace and Michael alone once again. Grace felt a surge of unease. If her hunch was correct, this wasn't just about her anymore. Lives could still be at stake, and the responsibility felt overwhelming. Michael's voice broke through her thoughts. "You did the right thing, Grace. Recognizing him now could make all the difference." Grace met his gaze, her chest tightening with emotion. "But it doesn't change the fact that I missed it during the flight. If he really is involved, I could have stopped this earlier." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "None of us are perfect. What matters is how we respond when the stakes are high. And right now, you're stepping up." Before Grace could respond, James returned, his expression more urgent than before. "We've confirmed it," he said. "Peter Graves is connected to the same group. He's already left the airport, but we've flagged his profile with authorities. They're tracking him as we speak." Grace felt a mix of relief and dread. The man was no longer in immediate proximity, but the threat he posed was far from over. She looked at Michael, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "What happens now?" Michael's expression softened, though his resolve was clear. "Now we do everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen again. And you, Grace, you've got a choice to make. You can let this experience define you in a negative way, or you can use it to become better." Grace felt the weight of his words settle over her. She nodded, determination flickering to life within her. "I'll be better," she said, her voice firm. "I promise." As the tension in the room began to dissipate, a new energy took its place. Grace knew she couldn't change the past, but she could learn from it. And for the first time in years, she felt like she was on the path to something greater, not just as a flight attendant, but as a person. But just as she was beginning to feel a sense of closure, Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "It's not over," he said quietly. "There's been another development." Grace's heart sank as the tension returned in full force. She realized that while this chapter of her journey was ending, the story was far from over. And as she prepared to face whatever came next, she knew one thing for certain: she would never be the same again.